Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Very excited to continue the conversation and share with my colleagues from Fremont Unified School District. Again, this is Dave Nagel. This is webinar 1A. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch the overview of why we prioritize standards. Now we're going to go through prioritizing English language arts standards. Quick example for the English language arts teacher. So again, a little bit about my background. I've spent my entire career at the secondary level as a practitioner, as a teacher and administrator in very large districts in Indiana. And my work as a presenter and consultant started because Larry Ainsworth came to my district. And so prioritizing standards and then eventually into one wrapping and common formative assessment was something I did at the classroom level as a building administrator, and then as a building administrator overseeing that process at the district level. And so I've had a chance over the course of my career to do so as a practitioner at the secondary level, and then certainly with districts similar to Fremont across the country. As I mentioned on the first webinar, there is something unique. In some ways, at the secondary level, we have to acknowledge, as we do at the elementary, that teaching and learning and prioritizing what is most important really doesn't change. But at the secondary level, there are some elements, specifically when we talk about our time frame within our schools, within our 18-week semesters, to really make sure that the time that we're utilizing on the priorities is essential. So I hope I have a chance to kind of bring some of that background and expertise to this group. So we're going to jump right in. Back to what I mentioned in the first webinar, a challenge all teachers face. Desire to make sure we can teach all that we can and we must with the limited time constraints. So this webinar, as we mentioned on the first one, is still hitting those first two success criteria, stating the rationale for developing a solid prioritized list of standards and then applying those four critical elements used in developing a list of prioritized standards. But now a chance to begin developing those prioritized standards for your specific teaching subject area for the units forthcoming, and for this particular webinar, English language arts. So hopefully you have your professional development webinar working handout for the first webinar, and then this one for English language arts. Again, our four criteria for developing priority standards: endurance, standards that will stand the test of time; readiness, what do students need to have as they go from 7th to 8th, from 9th to 10th in English language arts classrooms; what are those leverage topics that will help students make connection from English language arts to other subjects; and then, of course, external exams. And again, it's not, as I mentioned on the first webinar, it's not teaching to the test, but when we know the format or some of the specific standards, how well they're assessed, what that means in terms of making sure that our students are focused instructionally and how we assess them at the highest level around what is most essential. So I'm going to walk us through one real quick example. Which of these would you say is the priority from these three standards? Determining an author's point of view and purpose in the text, and how to analyze the author acknowledges or responds to conflicting evidence or viewpoints. Determine the meaning of words or phrases as they are used in text, including figurative, connotative, and technical meanings. Analyze the impact of specific word choices on meaning and tone, including analogies or allusions to other texts. Or 8.8, delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in the text, assessing whether the reasoning is sound, the evidence is sufficient, and recognize when irrelevant evidence is introduced. You also have these in your working handout. Please take a moment and pause the recording, and if you're working in a group, individually determine which of these standards would be the priority. And one thing to consider is it possible that one of these standards or two of these standards could be taught through another one? Take a moment, pause the recording, determine which one you would say out of these three would you feel is the priority. Back in just a moment. Welcome back. So hopefully you've had a chance to select what you think would be the priority standard. There's several ways to look at this, but the first one is, when we look at that first standard, determine how an author's point of view and purpose in the text, and analyze how the author acknowledges or responds to conflicting evidence or viewpoints. Key word there is analyze. When we look at that term analyze, that is at a higher level of rigor than just determining the meaning of words. Certainly, it's important that students understand the meaning of words and phrases, figurative, connotative, etc. But I think it's safe to say that we could teach that through 8.6. When we look at 8.8, because there's certainly been conversation and arguments that I've had with language arts teachers that kind of go both ways, that 8.8, where we delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in the text, is how we could, for sure, focus on 8.4, but maybe then 8.6. So the key is to not get not procrastinate and get bogged down into that debate. But when we know the number of standards that we have to teach and that we possibly could teach, certainly we can look at 8.4 as one that is important. But if we're making sure that that's a focus through some of our other units, through these other two standards, we have a chance to address both standards at a deep level. And if students are meeting 8.6 and 8.8, they likely are meeting 8.4. Again, this was one quick example at the language arts level after you've seen the first one to have a practical example with your content. And hopefully this gives you a chance to begin considering how you would develop a list of those prioritized standards for your specific teaching subject, and in this case, language arts, for several units that will be forthcoming this year. As always, any questions that you have anytime, please shoot me an email at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. As I include here on this final slide, I've already had some conversation with some individuals that shot me an email, and we had a dialogue on the phone. If that's something you're interested in, I'd be more than happy to do that as well. So, appreciate your time on this webinar. Language arts teachers, hopefully this gives you a little bit deeper dive with your specific content area, looking at how language arts standards could be prioritized with the filters of endurance, leverage, readiness, and certainly we'll talk later in the webinar series about how we connect these to external assessments. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.